Welcome to everyone. Welcome to Sarah Dougherty's presentation on the importance of interdisciplinary planning and execution of remediation projects for contaminated sites. Unfortunately, Sarah is unable to join us today, and rather than cancel the presentation, she has asked her father to give her talk, knowing that he has had extensive experience in this particular field. Sarah is a professional chemist with nearly 10 years of experience monitoring and remediating contaminated sites in Alberta. Her education in environmental chemistry and environmental science provides her with the knowledge she needs to successfully complete her work. David, who will be doing the presentation using her slides and her talk, is well known to many of you, but in this field, that's covered in this talk, he has been a certified environmental auditor and a professional biologist with over 2 decades of experience dealing with contaminated sites. So welcome, and Dave, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jean, and welcome to everybody. Really sorry that the closest you're going to get to my daughter today is over my shoulder. She's skiing at Sunshine Village, but no.
Not today, though.
Yeah, she's not feeling well, I'm afraid. So let me switch over to the presentation. So Sarah was originally asked to give this presentation for a professional chemists organization in Alberta, and it was doing a conference on interdisciplinary work. So they asked her if she'd be interested in giving a talk that had to do with remediation projects for contaminated sites. And so that's what we're going to see today, slightly modified by me, mainly to provide you with a little bit of extra information about Love Canal, which you'll see in a couple of slides. So construction projects have become integral to human society. These result in everything from the house in which you live, to the office in which you work, to the power plant that supplies the electricity on which you depend, and so much more. Infrastructure allows us to move and trade, and really facilitates all of our modern life. Our human ingenuity has allowed us to build very complex societies. Unfortunately, sometimes that complexity results in unexpected problems, or problems that were expected but just not valued the way one might want to have them valued. So when we build infrastructure, it is subject to degradation because of the laws of thermodynamics, really. Erosion certainly affects everything that we put in place. So does exposure to ultraviolet light, for example. Freeze-thaw cycles, heating become extremely important in some areas. There are places where things like asphalt surfaces, as down in the picture, are actually melting and not up to the stresses that we might subject them to supporting. And that particular picture is actually of a bridge collapse, which happened in Montreal a little over a decade ago now. See if I can move my thing out of the way. Okay, so degrading infrastructure, depending on the land use, one of the consequences of infrastructure failure can be the release of toxic substances. Sometimes, of course, toxics are being released really essentially on purpose. And this often used to be the case. In fact, we can still detect sites around the world that were polluted under the Roman Empire some 2,000 or so years ago. Most of the places where they mined materials like lead and copper can easily be identified, especially when those were being smelted near their mines. We can still find the toxins that were released as a result. We also know that the Romans contaminated a lot of the lakes in their empire, both with nutrients from agriculture and waste from things like towns and cities. And indeed, they would commonly dispose of waste into water, much in the same way that we do today. So there are all kinds of toxins out there that can be released into surface waters, groundwaters, soil, air, even into bedrock, which in fact is involved at Love Canal, which you'll see in a minute. And there are well over 60,000 man-made chemicals in addition to all of the minerals that are naturally occurring. So extremely complicated systems into which a wide variety of toxins can be introduced. So we haven't always known what the problems might be from releases, whether they were intentional or not. But certainly over the last, I would say, 50 or 60 years, we've been able to identify all sorts of effects on animals, vegetation, and other kinds of life, even down to bacteria. Move this box again. So contaminated sites are places where our human infrastructure has degraded and caused release of toxins into these surroundings. I should add to that, they also include places where we have simply allowed materials to get released, haven't sufficiently taken care to make sure they got contained or allowed the containers to degrade, which is what she's after here. Toxins can be persistent, especially if they are heavy metals, essentially never go away. Sometimes they can be changed into other forms that are more or less toxic than what is originally released. They can certainly make life ill. Life forms can get very sick from being in contact with toxins, whether they are absorbed through the skin, inhaled, ingested, whatever it might be. But sometimes the effects are really not very noticeable. For example, you can get effects on reproduction where you have an adult organism that appears healthy, but is incapable of producing viable offspring. And at the other end of the spectrum, it's possible to die from getting exposed to something on a contaminated site. So what can we do about contamination? We have a limited amount of livable land, as she termed it. Habitable land is another term, essentially equivalent. Any area where we have contaminated the land that might be important later for sustenance of other people and other life forms is what can be considered a contaminated site, and for all intents and purposes, no longer habitable. Cleaning up contaminated sites has been done for a long time, but it's really become ingrained in our thinking, I would say, in approximately the last 5 decades, really starting in about 1970 with the United States going forward with the United States Environmental Protection Agency and the National Environmental Assessment Framework that came in at the same time. In Canada, generally, we have a framework. It depends on which province it is in which you find yourself, because this is really not highly organized at a federal level. Sometimes you're subject to federal rules for one reason or another, such as land ownership. Often you're subject to provincial rules, and whichever one is the most stringent is probably the one that's going to have primary effect. There are, in her experience, approximately 4 phases. Earlier, when I was doing my work, I would have said there were probably as many as 6. So you have historical reviews that can include things like interviewing people who were present on the site at one time, looking at air photos, looking at previous monitoring information, looking at Landsat images from satellites. And if you find there's a reason to, should mention, insurance documents, extremely helpful for historical reviews. If you find that there's a reason for concern, you can move forward with the site assessment. Sometimes that's done in 2 stages. This is where I would have perhaps had a phase 3 that it was detailed site assessment as opposed to preliminary site assessment. And then planning your remediation, actually carrying it out in phase 3. Sometimes there are 2 different phases there. your remedial planning and your remedial execution, and eventually reclaiming the land to whatever use it is that you want to find for that particular site, whether it's returning it to nature, returning it to a park, turning it into a place for residences or commerce or industry. All depends on what you want to have as your final use, the level of cleanup that you're going to apply, essentially how safe you make the place. Contaminated sites are extremely long-term often. Some of them are designed to be, such as, for example, municipal landfills or hazardous waste landfills. They're designed to be there for a very long time. In modern systems, typically there's a liner, there's final cover, there's a leachate capture system under the liner, there's a gas capture system over top of the final cover, or actually embedded in it, but you can see it at the surface. And of course, this is not necessarily what you have as a plan. You could have a contaminated site that still might be there for a very long time. We have a famous one here in Ottawa, which is right around the end of Tunney's pasture. What's the place called? Jean, you're there. Unmute yourself for a moment. Where they're trying to build down.
LeBreton Flats.
LeBreton Flats. Very famous, thank you. Very famous contaminated site in Ottawa. And that was mainly because of a wide variety of small industry that was there. So if you have a contaminated site, you're often not allowed to build anything on it until you've done some kind of cleanup. So that would be called a brownfield. So what happens if you build on a contaminated site? She chose to bring forward one of the most famous contaminated site incidents in the world, which was at Love Canal. On the right-hand side, you can see the map. At the bottom, the blue area is Lake Erie. At the top, it's Lake Ontario. The water flows from the bottom to the top, south to north, passes right by Love Canal, and then goes over Niagara Falls, which is right here. And the original idea by William Love was that he would build a canal to bypass the falls and allow shipping to get between the two lakes more easily. There was a wide variety of problematic economic conditions in the 1890s and 1900s. Eventually, the canal project and the adjacent residential development project both went bankrupt. There were sales that resulted in the land being taken over by various organizations. One of them included a local power company. One of them included Hooker Chemical Company. I'm sure there were many more complex legal cases. So parts of the canal were used to dump municipal garbage in the 1920s and later by Hooker Chemical in the 40s and early 50s to dump chemical waste. Hooker Chemical was aware that what it had put into the ground was dangerous material, and they did not want to sell the land, but they were put into a situation where essentially they were forced to sell the land. They did, to a local school board for $1, but they managed to get a caveat put onto the title that said anyone who might in future take this land under ownership needs to be aware that there is buried chemical waste and we're not liable for it. At least that's what they tried to claim. In many ways, Hooker did everything that it possibly could to manage that site, as long as in fact they were going to be allowed to bury this waste. They did put a compacted clay liner underneath. They put a compacted clay liner over top. They let everybody know that the material was buried, and they put the caveat on the title. So if you look briefly at the diagram on the right, the dark gray area is where the canal was. And right in the middle, there's a little square. This is where eventually a school was built, and there were approximately 100 houses built on either side. And the whole of this gray area was turned into a residential area with approximately 500 dwelling units and 250 or so low-income housing units. This is because the board had sold off part of the land for residential development. And when they did that, the board did not carry forward the caveat onto the parcels of land that were sold. So people who were buying these houses did not properly get informed of the presence of the waste. During the course of developing this area, the cap and the liner were pierced multiple times, multiple different places. And eventually liquid waste started to come out of the barrels that had been buried. It did surface, it got into people's backyards, it got into people's basements. In 1977, there was a particularly high snow year. You might have noticed on the previous slide, this is very close to Buffalo. This is at the end of the lake where they get those enormous snowstorms, sometimes well over a meter of snow. When it melts, it raises the groundwater. That pushed any of the waste that was not miscible with water and would float because it was less dense to the surface, and you had blackish liquids coming out, and it turned into a real nightmare. There were over 200 chemicals involved, and many of them were known carcinogens. As a result, gardens died, but people started getting sick. And it turned out that lots of the young families that were present in the area were experiencing defects among the children that they were having. Eventually, the United States federal government, the EPA, was forced to take over the site, and it became one of the first sites that was put on the national priorities list under Superfund and the comprehensive, I wrote that name down because I knew it was going to be difficult. Circa. Maybe I left the notes upstairs. Where's Circa? Comprehensive Environmental Responsibility legislation. Anyway, the L standard stood for liability. Of course, it doesn't affect Canada directly, and I haven't been involved in this kind of work for a long time. So Circa is kind of not in front brain at the moment. So this took place, the remediation of the site, over approximately 20 years. And in fact, they have now got people who have been moved back into the area, residential occupation. You can see some of the kinds of cancer incidents that were present in the area, elevated beyond levels that were to be expected from the number of people who were living there. So unlike landfills, many contaminated sites can be remediated and reclaimed. There's been the odd, very interesting situation with the landfill that had come to the end of its useful life, was capped, closed, and then they attempted to turn it over to a new use. There was a particularly famous case when I was first involved in remediation. Came to my attention in the 80s. I couldn't relocate it on the internet when I was reading up for this, but there was a landfill somewhere in the New York City area, I think in New Jersey, that built a new clubhouse. And on the day that they opened the clubhouse exploded because of methane gas that had accumulated inside. So you have to be very careful with what you do build on a site. You want to make sure that it's safe. Gasoline fuel stations, gasoline, diesel fuel, very common for these sites to be contaminated. Some of them have resulted in some horrendous costs for cleanup. And they're not necessarily even just places that were marked for retail sales. So for example, bus depots trucking companies, they often have their own fuel supplies on site, often in buried tanks, and those tanks can leak. In fact, one guy who was a tank installer told me that as a rule, 20 years or so ago, they figured that about 10% of all new fuel pump installations were leaking at the time they were turned on. So very common. So when you're remediating a site, the land use is going to depend on how well you have been able to remediate. If you haven't brought it down to acceptable levels, you're probably not going to be able to turn it into a place where people are allowed to live, as an example. Some transportation infrastructure projects can involve land acquisitions. You don't necessarily know if the land that you're buying is uncontaminated, and you need to be pretty bloody careful of what you're doing. I noticed this morning there are 123 old landfills in the Ottawa area. It's on the website through Open Ottawa Data. And one of them is in fact approximately 150 meters from my house. I had been unaware of its presence. Luckily, it is downhill from me. And highly unlikely that anything that was buried there, if there had been some contamination, would make its way to my particular residence. So prior to construction of new infrastructure, building, road, whatever it might be, you need to know that the remediation has been completed. You don't want to have something left in place that might adversely affect people's health or that might cause your structure to become compromised at some point in the future. As a result of that, you need to have a large number of disciplines involved in planning the reuse of a contaminated site, the cleanup, even the maintenance and ongoing management of a contaminated site requires that you use the expertise and knowledge in all sorts of disciplines. Some of these are trades as well. And some of them might come down to, I'm not sure that you would call it a trade, but for example, truck drivers. I was describing to Art yesterday that I was involved on work on a site where we had to bring in a portable incinerator to burn up some contaminated materials on site, much more cost effective to do it that way, given the large volumes they had. And they only had about 2 inches of clearance, 5 centimeters of clearance for this incinerator between a couple of the buildings that were on site. And it was only through having very good people at driving trucks that they were able to bring in and set up the incinerator. The cleanup itself is almost certain to involve many more people than you might think at the beginning, because lots of different people have interests in this. There's going to be all kinds of interest in making sure that the work is done properly, that workers aren't compromised, that neighbors aren't compromised, and that the people who will eventually occupy the site aren't compromised. And that's not to ignore wildlife and vegetation that might be in the area as well. Excuse me. So we're talking about involving large numbers of professionals, many walks of life, to make sure that you get a safe place to occupy. So she's got 3 case studies that she wanted to bring to people's attention. She can't, of course, mention exactly where these happened nor who was involved. Suffice to say, the first of these was an urban area. They were going to do a major infrastructure project, redevelop the place. So the municipality owned all the land already, which is a plus in a sense, in that if any records were maintained, they already had them in their possession. But they had to figure out what volumes of material would need to be removed, what volumes of that material might be reused, what might need to be sent for treatment. They had to look at when the work actually could be accomplished, because they had to deal with things like the presence of migrating wildlife. That can be birds, that can be in particular amphibians, reptiles, and fish. They often, you could say, get in the way of. I'm not sure it isn't we who are getting in the way. New projects. And there were a lot of engineering designs that needed to be put in place. So the engineers needed to make sure that they were aware of all the site conditions. This would have included the groundwater, the subsurface, the surface material, and the eventual landscape condition, rolling terrain or whatever it might be that they wanted to leave in place. Prior to construction, they had to do wildlife surveys to make sure that they were not going to compromise important local birds in particular. They assessed risks because they knew there was a possibility that some of the material on site could actually affect the health and safety of workers who were coming in to build new infrastructure. They needed to be aware of chemicals at the site because what had been buried was actually known at the time to have produced hydrogen sulfide and methane gas when it was broken down. So they had to manage all those types of things. During the remediation, they had a number of problems. This picture is not from that particular site, but it shows the kind of thing that can happen on a landfill site, depending on what's been put in place. They had two things happen here. One was they over-excavated some of the material. That is, they took out material they weren't supposed to remove. Mistake on the part of a contractor who was involved, but that required them going back and reassessing and preparing new drawings and new engineering. And in some places, exposure of the contaminated materials that had been buried resulted in spontaneous combustion. A number of times, the fire department had to be called to put out fires that were on the site, and they had to put in a ring of monitoring wells to look for subsurface spread of the fire to make sure that it didn't go nuts. As you might imagine, undertaking this kind of project required a lot of construction expertise. A lot of municipal officials were involved, in part because they owned the site. Emergency services, because among the things they had to come out and put out fires. Engineers, government officials. I'm sure all of the neighbors were concerned, as you might imagine, if you lived next to the place where that kind of a fire was going on. This is a second case study, somewhat similar situation. There was a pond that had to be removed before the contamination that was underneath could be handled. This was a real challenge because there were thousands of cubic meters of water, and there was a lot that flowed into the pond as they lowered the water surface. So in effect, they were dewatering the nearby lands. Well, takes me back to something about Love Canal. The materials there actually got released into the subsurface and went right into the limestone bedrock underneath, traveled northwest, and were detectable in the walls of the Niagara Gorge. And the material that was running down the rock wall on the inside of the gorge was getting vaporized and becoming part of the air in the gorge. Next time you're thinking about going on the Maid of the Mist tour, you might want to think twice. Actually, I think they've cleaned it up, so you probably don't have that concern anymore. anyway, they built a treatment facility right on this site to make sure that they could clean the water, test the water, make sure it was not something that couldn't be put into the sewers. There are municipal sewer bylaws in most cities that prevent you from putting highly contaminated material into sewers. So they had to make sure that they were within various guidelines, and certainly they wanted to make sure that they wouldn't put anything in that was so contaminated that would kill off the bacteria that live in the treatment system of the city, because that's extremely sensitive and also expensive to handle if you've had a breakdown. So once they got the material out, we got the water out first, then they excavated the material. They had to put in place a new stormwater pond in the same place. And of course, that required being very careful with what they put in place and what they moved elsewhere. If you're doing new construction, one of the things that you have to consider is, what are you putting in place if you're bringing in fill? You've probably seen signs before, clean fill wanted. Well, the last thing that you want is dirty fill. Nobody's going to call it that, let alone call it contaminated fill, but there's an awful lot of that around, and you need to be very careful about what you bring in and put on your land if you're looking at importing fill. The next case study is going to show why that's really important. So you need to know from where your material is coming, and if your budget will afford it, you need to do some testing to make sure what you have. If you can't afford it, it may come back to haunt you. So the third case study is a place where, and that's the photo on the right is not associated with this place. It just happens to be a photo showing the collection of methane at a site where there's buried material. They brought in fill, put it in place, built their stuff, found they had a methane gas problem. Required going back and putting in a collection system and extracting this material, and now they have a long-term methane management plan. Could have been avoided if they had thought more carefully about what they were bringing into place. So her conclusion is that construction projects are challenging at all times, but particularly so if a contaminated site is involved. And she had all kinds of examples of places where contamination needs to be suspected. For example, places where you've had mines, wells, fuel stations, repair shops, dry cleaners, warehouses, factories, landfills, pipelines, generators, fuel tanks, transformers, farms, greenhouses. I mentioned landfills, but the old word for landfills was dumps. Landfills these days are lined and capped when they're finished. Dumps usually had neither of those. So a wide variety of different sites can be contaminated. In some of my experience, contamination can be particularly bad at many places you really wouldn't expect, but here's a good example: firing ranges, because the lead and copper that's in old firing ranges is actually pretty dangerous. The complexities of construction at contaminated sites make it vital that there be lots of professionals involved and that they have a wide variety of experience, have learned in the field, climbed the pole, hauled on the rope, so they know what to expect. But even then, you can get surprised. And under the circumstances, it's extremely important that everybody involved in such a team be in communication at all times and know what's going on site. And so that's the end of the presentation. I would love to entertain questions if there are any.
Thank you, Dave. Yes, we do have a few questions lined up. I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first question. And Art Hunter is going to be the one who's on deck after me. So when you're planning for site remediation, like what jurisdictions are involved, and you know, federal, provincial, municipal, and if there's more than one jurisdiction that you have to pay attention to, which one takes priority?
I don't think it's actually fair to say that one should take priority over another. You'll have in Canada anyway, all three jurisdictions on some types of property. If there's a reason for federal involvement, the feds will need to be there. Provincial involvement is going to be the case almost all the time. Municipal involvement is possible. I suppose you could be out in a relatively remote place, but even these days, you know, most places have rural municipalities, so there would be a municipal government involved. If there's no federal involvement, then you're looking at dealing with the environmental organization for the province, and also there are occupational health and safety concerns to be taken into consideration.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Art, you're up, and on deck is John Meyer.
Okay, I just got a quick comment that I had a colleague who in fact worked for a company who used the Waterloo Barrier to contain any contaminants from that were put there from the many sites that you rhymed off. And the concept there was to prevent the movement of groundwater, and that the natural microbes, bacteria and viruses and things that are in the soil would eventually do a lot of the cleanup process for you. And apparently they were quite successful at doing this, and there's companies are still doing it to this day. Just a comment, if you know about the Waterloo Barrier, just be interested to know. But my real question is, with climate change, we know that the receding ice packs and glaciers, etc., are releasing pockets of methane and goodness knows what other gases that are in fact contributing more to the greenhouse gases. And has there been, to best of your knowledge, any attempts by these folks who are now getting rather skilled in cleanup from the dumps that mankind has done, to transfer that to some of those dumps which nature has left behind? Or is remediation not even considered and just leave it up to nature to handle as best she does?
Okay, I'm going to come back to the Waterloo Barrier after trying to answer that question. The first thing I would say is that while we have known that increasing the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere was going to be problematic for darn close to 200 years, we really only started to acknowledge it in the scientific community about 60 years ago. And until about 20 years ago, I would say we were still really struggling to get people to acknowledge that climate change was happening, let alone that people were responsible. I don't think that there has been a sufficient amount of time for us to consider doing things like methane capture on what we now recognize as the melting permafrost. It's extensive. Many hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of land are now producing methane. And I don't think very much has been done in terms of thinking about how we might deal with that material. For the most part, it's just going into the atmosphere at the present time. I think that probably sufficiently covers your real question, but it does raise an interesting point that we may well see one of the costs in future of dealing with climate change is going to be trying to capture this very diffuse source of methane, these huge areas of permafrost that are melting. Now, back to the Waterloo Barrier, I know one thing that I didn't mention is that if you've got a contaminated site, you've got two main ways of dealing with it, two categories, if you will. In situ, that is in place treatment, and the Waterloo Barrier fits there, or offsite treatment. And sometimes what you can do is bring in something like an incinerator or a water treatment plant that you would install on the surface. I described an incinerator going into a site that happened to be in the United States, where they needed to destroy a bunch of material that had been highly contaminated with trichlorophenol. And in one of Sarah's case studies, they brought in a water treatment plant to dewater that pond, which did contain contaminants from the material underneath. So those are just two examples of how you can treat in situ. Another one is actually, in a sense, they're not in situ in that the material had to be removed and then put into the treatment train. But the Waterloo Barrier truly is treating it in situ, where you put in a trench and you fill the trench with iron filings. And then as the water naturally moves through that trench, a lot of different chemical reactions happen in the trench, and they destroy the chemicals that you were trying to get rid of and produce a relatively clean groundwater on the other side. Only works for some types of contaminants, won't work, for example, for most heavy metals. Your alternative is just to take, whether it's water or soil, offsite and treat it somewhere else. So, for example, there is a hazardous waste treatment center in Alberta. I'm not sure it's still in operation. It was about 5 years ago, the last time I checked, where they'll incinerate soil if you've got highly contaminated soil. And if it isn't something that can be destroyed by incineration, they'll solidify it and put it into a Class 1 hazardous waste landfill.
Thank you. So John Mayer, you're on, and Phil Riley, you're on deck.
Hey, Dave, lots of questions. I'm in Perry Sound, and Perry Sound Harbor was once surrounded by many types of oil depots, large and small oil tanks. And that's left a number of sites that I think would be considered brown. What kind of uses can these sites be put to? I mean, can it ever be, it's granite here. And I understand that whatever has seeped into the ground is down into the cracks of the rocks. And some large tracts of land are still being held by the oil companies, Imperial Esso being one. And since I'm on the Active Transportation Committee, I would dearly love to use this land for trails along the waterfront and relieve Imperial Esso of the burden of carrying these lands. They will not give the land to anyone, from my understanding, and the only people they would sell to would be a financial entity of financial sufficient size to assure that if they are sued sometime in the future, the current ownership would be able to absorb the lawsuit, as opposed to having it land back on Imperial Esso's books in 20 years or whatever. And that's the question. What kind of, is it possible for governments to just buy these sites, and rather than having them lie useless, assume all of the liabilities and maybe not even buy the sites, but have the sites donated by oil companies, and have the government assume all liabilities and allow certain uses on them. And by assuming liabilities, I'm saying make it impossible to sue. legislate the complete immunity from lawsuit. So, general question, but how do we move from abandoned or idle brown sites to something that could be useful?
Okay, complicated question. You first should probably understand, I did find, by the way, CERCLA in my notes here. Exxon in particular, and all the major American oil companies, and even a lot of Canadian companies, not necessarily oil companies, but a lot of Canadian companies will be familiar with the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act. That's it, CERCLA. Now that act essentially made it so that in the United States, if you polluted, you're responsible and you can't dodge it. Mm-hmm. And if you put, and it's joint and several liability. If you put a few drums of hazardous waste in among 50,000 drums of hazardous waste that later became a Superfund site, you're jointly and severally liable for the cleanup. So the American approach has been, you did the crime, you're going to do the time, or you're going to pay the fines. And they have approximately, at the moment, I believe they have 1,300 or so sites on their national priority list, and you got to be a pretty nasty big site to get on that NPL. If you look in Canada, this is just what is known in the federal National Contaminated Sites Inventory. 23,897 sites, 14,850 of them have been closed, but there are just under 5,000 actively managed sites and 4,000 suspect sites. So when you describe that there were tanks present around your marina, that kind of thing's present everywhere, all over the place. And could you do anything with it? Well, it would cost a lot of money. And that's why these oil companies are not doing anything about it. If they can maintain ownership and not be forced to do anything about it, they're hoping that eventually it won't be a problem for which they have to pay any money. So that's what they're looking to avoid, is paying any money. Could a government come along and take over a site? Yes, it could. Could it absolve a corporation of future liability? Absolutely. If it needed to, it probably could write a law that specifically said, now this was done not long ago in Ontario, you're not allowed to sue us. Mm-hmm. So then if anybody got injured, it's that person who would pay the costs, right? Not just of the injury, but all of the rehabilitation costs, if you want to put it that way. Let's say you went somewhere and I don't know. I mean, we're not talking here, oil tanks at Parry Sound. They probably had diesel fuel and perhaps gasoline and that sort of thing. Yeah. We're probably not talking about something that would cause an explosion somewhere. But if somebody got killed in an explosion, then usually the estate would be looking for compensation.
Yeah. Well, they're saying they can't build on it. They can't build houses on it. That sort of thing. Right now, the tanks obviously are gone, and we've got pipes in the ground that I think they used to pump dispersants into the rock formations, and so I mean, I don't really know what's down there. I don't think it's public domain. What is down there, the testing, I don't think that is public domain. But it would be just nice to get the land back in use. And okay, you can't build houses on it, but maybe people can walk across it.
So this kind of thing is common. For example, all across the country, there are many old railway lines and old railway yards, and right. Some of these have been cleaned up. There was a rather famous one in Moncton where the Moncton Yards got cleaned up to the tune of $17 million and eventually turned over, I think, in part to parks and in part to residences and in part to commercial operation. So yes, that this kind of thing is done on a regular basis. Why it hasn't specifically been done in the Parry Sound area, I don't know, but I can tell you one thing. Unless they go after the people who are responsible for putting that in place, it will cost the public purse a lot of money.
Yeah, okay. Okay, thanks. Good stuff.
Okay, thank you. John, Phil Riley, you're on, and Ted Manning, you're up next.
Yeah, an interesting sequel to the just completed discussion. One of the places that we visited, we've been to many different botanical gardens on North America and some in Europe. The Brooklyn Botanical Garden is actually built on an old ash dump. And so there was an example of rehabilitating the land, not having a lot of what we call it, commercial value to it, but certainly public appeal. And the plants don't know about the contaminants. If they can survive, they can grow and mature, and they can become park-like or worthy of the classification of a botanical garden. And so then I start thinking in terms of the Carp Dump, that huge mountain that's in Stittsville. Can places like that not be used as places to plant trees and use it as a carbon capture site? Once you get the plants planted, you don't have to have a lot of people visiting it in order for the carbon capture to take place. Just a couple of comments.
Okay, first, an observation related to the botanical garden built on ash. If there is a cap and that cap is not compromised by the roots of the plants, then the plants are isolated from the ash. If groundwater isn't flowing through the ash and taking soluble material in the form of heavy metals off the site, then you've got a good use. The site's isolated, and that can probably go on for a very long time. But the presence of the ash does mean that there are heavy metals there. It's very commonly known there are heavy metals in coal ash. So potentially problematic. I don't know what was done at the site to make sure that it will continue to be safe into the future, but let's assume for the moment that everything that could be done was done. With respect to carbon capture on a place like the Carp Dump, which just got another, 15 years? I think they just got expanded for another 15 years worth of waste from large areas of Ontario.
Probably not on the same hill, on adjacent property.
Could be. Maybe they're going to cap that area. There will be methane coming off there for a very long time. If they've got a good isolation system that will capture that methane, they could probably get enough out of the root zone that trees or whatever else you might want to plant on there wouldn't get compromised. You could certainly imagine that if there's enough methane in the soil, you could see some damage to the roots of trees. Haven't looked into that, so don't know their specifics, but it's a real possibility. On the other hand, if they have an excellent cap in place, yeah, you could see putting a forest in there, and if it's a good cap, you could use it for recreational purposes.
Yeah, one of the things that they did do back a number of years ago, 15 years or so ago, was that they've been harvesting the methane in order to produce electricity.
Right. That's very common these days.
If I can add, there is a mountain, a garbage mountain outside of Saskatoon on Lake Diefenbaker, which has been turned into the only ski hill in Saskatchewan that was running near Saskatoon, just so that you know. Anyway, sorry. Okay, thank you, Phil. Ted, you're up.
Blackstrap Mountain.
Blackstrap Mountain, that's what it's called. I
So
couldn't
did
remember
they
the
run
name.
the ski lift off the methane?
That's right. Anyway,
Not when
Ted,
they
you're
first-
John Hollins, you're on deck.
Not when they first installed it, Ted.
Yeah. I'm just, Dave and I played with this for a long time and delighted to see that your daughter's in the same field and she's setting you up so you can answer the very same question she would. I had a couple of interesting experiences. One I'll mention, and I'd like to Dave to go into the others. He and I and several other people set up a process by which you actually sold the property once cleaned up in a revolving fund for all of these rail yards. We started with the CN yards in downtown Toronto and essentially got a loan from the government to spend a lot of money cleaning it up. And now it's high-rise condos and a lot of very wealthy sites. And they took the money from selling that very, very expensive property and used the money for the next nastiest site, which could be sold at a very high price. That was Owen Sound, and then London, the downtown London, and so on, and worked their way down using the money from the last one to pay for the next ones. So I know Dave's been on it after I left, but you can tell me a little bit about what's happened next on that one. Second, what happened with the ones you were doing to try and clean up all those DND sites in the north that were known to be contaminated, and it was a government policy to fix. And finally, how much you found when you did the stuff on how much it cost to actually clean up a leaking gas station site on an average in Canada. So I'm asking a lot of questions, but I know
Okay.
you know the answers.
Yeah, well, I know some of the answers.
Yeah.
I know I shouldn't talk about some of the answers. And I probably don't know as much as you'd like me to know on some things, but let me deal with these in the reverse order of what you asked them.
Sure.
I believe that the study that we did circa 1995, so your numbers would have to get inflated to get it into current dollars. I think the average cost for remediating a gasoline style retail installation in Canada was about $187,000. And there was a very wide range because on some sites, for all intents and purposes, nothing was done. On other sites, yeah, something was done, but not what really should have been done. For example, there were sites where they went in with a backhoe and no health and safety precautions at all, dug up some soil, dumped it in the back of a truck, took it off to the local dump and dumped it without telling the people owning and running the dump what was in it and paying their $40 a ton to dump it. And you know, one of those trucks holds maybe something like 10 yards. So you're talking maybe 200 tons. Is that right? No, not even that. 10 yards would be about 20 tons. And so, you know, 10 truckloads, a couple $1,000. It's pretty cheap. So if you don't spend any money on anything, you don't keep records, you don't get a certificate of reclamation from any authority, you don't involve professionals, you don't need to spend much money. In fact, somebody mentioned earlier a place where people are literally sitting on it, just not going to clean it up unless they're forced to, no cost. But it can be really expensive. There was a gas station that leaked in Orleans in the late 90s that resulted in a cleanup cost well over $1 million. As far as D&D in the north, sorry, a lot of that is classified information I'm not allowed to discuss. A lot of it also, I wasn't directly involved in it. They certainly did have lots of sites, many of which, probably all of which, were placed on the federal contaminated sites inventory. And many of them will be in the group that are closed, because I know they've done lots of work to make sure those places have been properly remediated. And in a sense, you know, they've got deep pockets, and they've been pretty responsible about cleaning up material that's been left behind, some of which dates back to World War I. I was actually involved in a rather well publicized project to get rid of essentially chemical weapons, 2 or 3 different types of chemical weapons that were in place down near Suffield on the range at Suffield. And they had in fact come from World War I. And then as far as what was going on with the CN lands, that's the thing to which you're referring, you know, the CN lands down near CN Tower. All I can tell you is that the Canada Lands Company, for which we did a little bit of work, did get funding. First of all, they retained many bits of land and sold off parts of it when CN was privatized, but many old areas that had been old rights of way and old rail yards, they were kept by Canada Lands, and Canada Lands has been cleaning them up. You might recall that we went down and tried to look at what their plans were and estimate how much money was required, and much of that money was essentially pulled out of the deal and put aside on a table to make sure that that cleanup did happen. And the Moncton Yards was one of those places.
Thank you, Dave. Just setting you up. These people should know how much you know, because he is one of Canada's specialists on the same thing as his daughter. So it's just, this was a serendipitous substitution.
Thanks, Ted.
Okay.
John Hollins, you're next, and Peter Bolkowski, you're on tap.
Oh, thank you, Dave, for the breadth and clarity of your observations. I remember the gas station in Orleans to which you referred. It's about 5 kilometers from where I live in Blackburn Hamlet. I'm not sure, but I think the site was simply abandoned. I don't think it's been put to any use subsequent to its being refurbished. I've been listening for the last several weeks to all kinds of federal politicians promoting infrastructure programs. My sense is that those federal politicians don't have any sense whatever of what you've been telling us about. But when a municipality or a province gets some money out of one of those federal funds, can we citizens of Ontario, Canada, rely on the provincial and municipal levels of getting this right?
That's not a loaded question. That's not a loaded question.
I was hoping for a softball. Instead, you gave me a spitball. First of all, with respect to the thing in Orleans, let me guess. There's no gas station there, and there's no house there anymore.
No.
Okay, so they spent over $1 million getting the contaminated soil out. I don't know what they did with it, whether they actually put it into a hazardous waste landfill, or whether they put it in a dump, or whether they sent it off for incineration. No idea, but let's assume they did the right thing. Shall we say that? And they still haven't come through with a new use for the land. So it wouldn't surprise me if they, in fact, didn't remove all of the contamination and they left some of it remain in place, and we're hoping that it undergoes what's called natural attenuation. So if there are bacteria in the ground that are able to metabolize material like octane, for example, common constituent in gasoline, then eventually over time, they will lower the concentration of that material, liquid and or gas in the ground. And that's called natural attenuation. As far as what provinces and cities might do with any federal monies given to them or any responsibilities transferred onto their shoulders as a result of land deals and such, I can't comment on that at all. The one thing I can tell you is that most politicians seem to be very much like Donald Trump. If nothing else, unpredictable.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, John. Peter, you're up.
I didn't really have a question. I had a comment, and it's based on Love Canal and it's based on other sites. Basically, the Waterloo Barrier and there are various types of that are great. They work in certain types of problems, but over time, governments forget, sometimes intentionally forget or ignore what's there, and those barriers are going to be disrupted, breached through actions of other developers, allowed or encouraged by the government wanting to take the land. That's the story of Love Canal. Hooker Chemical certainly did things according to the best of its time, which we recognize now is not adequate, but Hooker did try and prevent development on that land. And it was a government that went and did it. And so I think the Waterloo Barrier is great, but that inherently is a problem long-term. And, you know, our lifetimes are not long. 50 years from now, people will forget what's where.
Absolutely. I agree with all of that. If I might, rather than giving an answer, because yours was just a comment, I'd like to let people know a little bit more about what happened with the Love Canal situation. Niagara Power and Development Company, or corporation, I think, was actually the owner of the land in the 1940s. And they gave Hooker Chemical permission to put the waste in place. Hooker Chemical started in 1903. Their first product was chlorine, but they were also producing sodium hydroxide at the time. And later, I'm going to give you a list of some of the kinds of things that they produced. And some of this, probably spoiled batches or whatever, did make its way into the landfill. Chlorobenzene, which was used for picric acid, which went into shells for World War I. Trichloroethylene, common at the time. Dry cleaning solvent. Later we went over to PERC, which is perchloroethylene. Phenol, commonly used still, both as a product on its own and in industrial production. They made hydrogenated vegetable oil. They made sulfur chloride, sodium sulfide, aluminum chloride, dodecyl mercaptan, which was then used for rubber and was what kept large trucks on the road in World War II. They made plastic resins. They made arsenic trichloride, thionyl chloride, hexachlorobenzene, and epoxy vinyl ester resins. So a few of these things by themselves are nasty. Many of them were used to make all kinds of very useful, critical products for modern society. And we couldn't have won both world wars without the work that was going on in some of their facilities. And it was all sold to Occidental Petroleum in 1968.
Thanks for the history.
So whatever you do, don't breathe the air.
I don't have any other people on the list yet to do some discussions or had any other questions or comments, but I would like to add something to the question that John Hollins had asked with respect to, do the governments know, with all these infrastructure programs being funded, whether or not what Dave's talking about is, or what Sarah was presenting and Dave was talking about, is taken into account. I do know that many infrastructure projects are now being done and run by well, not necessarily multinational, but multifaceted engineering companies. And Sarah does work for one of those. She's in the environmental arm and the arm is called Advisian, and she works for Worley, which is an Australian multinational engineering company. And when engineers nowadays are being trained, they are being taught how to do interdisciplinary studies and project planning, taking into account multifaceted and multidisciplinary projects. So to a degree, one would assume that they know this, and that the companies who will do these infrastructure projects will do it. That doesn't guarantee that it'll get done. The other thing I'd like to say is that governments, especially in Ontario and the conservative governments over the last, say, 20 years, we used to have some, I can't say stringent environmental assessments that needed to be done before a project was executed. And one of the things I think of was the building of the Highway 416 from Ottawa down to the 401. And what they did, they had to apply and get an environmental assessment that would clear them to be able to do the building. And instead of actually complying with the spirit of the law, what they did was they broke up each section into very small sections so that they could do the environmental assessment for small bits rather than the whole project. And it just gutted, and it could easily have really compromised what was done on the project. So they do have some, but they have also gutted some of the things that were in place before. Ted, you wanted to?
I have a related question. How are governments in Canada now dealing with walkaway liabilities? Because, I mean, in the past, we have an awful lot of sites that are now ours, whether we wanted them or not. And are we doing any better now? Is anybody aware of anything that's actually causing people to accept the accountability for the messes they leave?
I have only limited information with respect to this because I haven't had to deal with it in quite a few years. And, you know, they can change the law at the drop of a hat. So what I can tell you is, to my knowledge, we don't have anything close to CERCLA. And I have had personal experience with situations where, for example, an oil refinery was put in place on a farm. When it closed, they sold it to a developer who put in place an interior mall, shopping mall, the old style, not you know, not outdoors and not 5 big buildings on a parking lot kind of thing, but enclosed. Well, the refinery knocked down its surface infrastructure and left everything subsurface in place. This included ponds that had been used for putting in place wastewater and for collecting surface water. And I don't know, there were many meters of sludge left in the ponds. All of the pipes that were underground, the typical way that a pipe is abandoned underground is you just cut off the end and stick a plug in it. You don't clean it out. So over time, the pipe gets perforated and whatever was inside does come out. This did happen at this particular shopping center, and people started to get sick because the gases were coming through the floor. And the company's bankrupt, long gone.
Yeah. Well, just like a lot of old mine sites and so on, Canada's got a.
I think we have over 10,000.
The only one I can really think we did fairly well was for surface coal mining in Saskatchewan, where they actually made them rehabilitate one, but before they could dig the one next. And it was sort of marching along and they tied them to making the land the same class as it was before they started, including both drainage and soil cover. So decent land was still decent land, and only the really lousy land was cheaper to do, and therefore we've made a lot of the mines go onto the lousy land.
So this was kind of the intent behind the permits that were given out for surface mining in the oil sands, tar sands, bitumen mining, whatever you want to call it. The intent was go in there, disturb the land, and when you're done, put it back the way it was.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen.
No, it hasn't happened much.
They have, I think they've gotten a reclamation certificate for something like 100 hectare plot.
Thanks, Dave. John Mayer, you had a question.
Yeah, just one last thing, exactly on the oil sands. In the US, there are 3 million oil wells that they've drilled that many. I would imagine most of them are not used anymore. And given fracking, most of them will go dormant soon. And so I think a lot of the companies there simply won't be around to clean up. In Canada, we have that problem. We also have the problem of the oil sands. And I've found that the official Alberta stat for the cost of the cleanup of the oil sands is about 50, I think it was 56 billion. An unofficial estimate by one of the fellows, government employees who was involved, was 250 billion. So my question to you is, do you have any feel whatsoever of what the cost might be of remediating the oil sands that we've mined to date?
Okay. You guys are full of difficult questions today.
Just say GMP, Dave.
No, I'll tell a little story first. You may have heard it before. The giant Yellowknife gold mine at Yellowknife, they took about $4 billion worth of gold out of that mine. And the cleanup is going to cost in the range of $4 billion.
Yeah.
So they might as well have not done any of the work. You know, those stories about those guys digging a hole. Why are you digging a hole? So we can fill it back in.
Yeah, that's
okay. So
yeah,
I mean, it depends on how they're allowed to go about it, right? Mm-hmm. When they were first given the permissions, the idea was put the land back into the condition it was. Now the plan over a lot of that area is to use what's called an end pit lake. How convenient. If you do an end pit lake, you don't have to fill in the excavation. You don't have to move any more earth. You dug a big hole, now you've got a lake. There you go. That's all you got to do.
Okay.
And if you're lucky, their plans are essentially that over time, through natural attenuation, anything that's toxic that's in there will get rendered non-toxic, and it'll all stay in the lake, and it will never get out of the lake, won't go into the groundwater, won't go into the air, won't get carried away by any kind of wildlife or winds or whatever. And everything, you know, they're going to turn into lakes and we'll be able to go and fish.
Okay.
Not sure I want to eat the fish.
And if you're interested, I've got some nice swampland in Florida.
We can start selling the fish too to people who know nothing about this.
Well, I could still go fish in China. You know those six-eyed fish that you always used to tell me you loved to eat when you went to China?
Yeah, right.
I do have one other.
Well, that was really what happened to Lake Tai, wasn't it, Dave?
I have one other comment to make, especially with regards to returning something to its original state. You have to realize that in the Athabasca area in the tar sands, there were significant portions of geologic units that were at the surface. And the reason it's a tar sand now is that all of the gaseous and much of the liquid part of what would be the petroleum source rock there had already been degraded to the point where all you're left with is the bitumen. So that naturally, what was at the surface was the tar sands. So how do you replace it and get it back to that state?
okay,
And,
but
and Dave has a better
okay, but
example.
it
yeah.
wasn't at the surface. There is overburden over all of it. And
Yes.
I mean, the natives, the indigenous people who were living there knew that the stuff was present because there were tar balls in the river. And that's because at various points in the river valley, there are cliff faces where some of the material is actually exposed in the side of the cliff, and the water is flowing by, and it's dropping down into the river and getting rolled around. So up on the surface, adjacent to the river valley, it's all covered with overburden.
Yeah.
And it was originally boreal forest.
And it was definitely not the size that the tar sands are now. There's no question about that, but the stuff was very near the surface.
Yeah, and
the
actually,
other one,
most of the bitumen that's being brought out now is being brought out by SAGD, steam-assisted gravity drainage.
Yeah.
So the kind of thing that was being pioneered in, I guess, circa 1980 by Esso, Imperial Oil at Cold Lake.
yeah. I'd also like to point out that there has been in Sydney, in Nova Scotia, in Cape Breton, there have been attempts to clean up the Sydney tar ponds. Now, the Sydney situation is really quite interesting because they're right over the coal mines, and the coal mines are at or very near the surface. So you cannot, the water, there's enough groundwater, and there's enough, it's right near the coast as well. So there's enough water that penetrates into the coal mines that you're going to get, no matter what you do, you're going to get organic contamination coming up from the mines regardless. So you can't clean it up to what would be the kinds of things that you might look for a residential thing. You just have to be very careful what you say, get it back to what's the natural site. You have to know, as Sarah said in her talk, you have to know what's there, and you have to understand how it got there. And that's where it takes geologists and all these other professionals involved, so that when it comes to cleanup and remediation, you know to what level you each even might have a chance to get it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
If you have interest in time, Maud Barlow with somebody else wrote a book about the tar sands, and it's probably not the only one out there. And it's in some ways a sordid history. It was originally discovered that they had trouble because there was fishing going on, a lot of it for lobsters, but some other things as well. Just off the coast. I mean, you said it was right on the coast. Yeah, it is. And they pulled up some lobsters, and for whatever reason, they sent them for testing, and lo and behold, they had PCBs in them.
Elizabeth May cut her teeth on that one. That's how she ended up in the legislature.
Yeah. And yeah, long and sordid history.
Yeah.
But there was a steel mill, there was transportation of coal, and there was a very large municipal dump waste. Not just commercial garbage, but household waste. And there was dumping of raw sewage by the town into the adjacent creek and down into the little bay that became the Sydney tar ponds. And it's a horrible mess. It really is a horrible mess.
Yeah.
It's now a tourist attraction, quite frankly. Some waste engineers go just to visit it.
The last time I was there, there was a baseball field with chain link fence and trying to prevent fly balls from hitting the crowd and such. And every few meters along that fence is a sign that says toxic area, do not go here. And I don't know why they would allow kids to play in that field.
On that, I think it's time for us to stay. And Dave, if you want to get the last slide up, that would be great.
I'll bring it.
But while you're doing that, I'd like to say, on behalf of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, I would like to thank Sarah for providing the content and the ideas for this talk, and for her willingness to actually move her talk to suit our schedule. This talk was originally set up twice in the spring, and we asked her to change it. And so I really like to thank her for her willingness to help us along. And I'd also very much like to thank Dave for stepping into the breach when Sarah wasn't able to come today. So I really, really appreciate that for both of you. So thank you. And for everyone else that's still online, I'd like to say thank you very much for attending today's presentation. You can see this soon on the CanadianCorps.com website. And if you are not a member of CACOR, we would really appreciate if you would try to become a member. Very inexpensive, and you can see all the information on our website there. And for all the other people, when you want to go on and look at some of the videos that we have got for all of our Zoom presentations, please click the subscribe button because that will help us. Anyway, with that, again, thank you, Dave, and thank you, Sarah.
See you later, Sarah. Have a great run.
Exactly.